Perhaps no sector that is seeking to decarbonize is more difficult than the building sector. Here to speak to us today about that is Joe Uglietto. Joe is the president of Diversified Energy Specialists, a renewable energy consulting and environmental markets trading company. Joe has consulted on projects for the National Biodiesel Board and the National Oil Heat Research Alliance on a range of topics with the common goal of decarbonizing the building sector in the Northeast. Joe's recent work has focused on renewable thermal technologies and the flaws of current electrification policy. Are we all set for Joe? We're good. Joe, you're on.
So thank you for the introduction. My name is Joe Uglietto. I'm out of just outside Boston, Massachusetts, and I deal with mostly the thermal sector. As far as the thermal sector goes, probably the most difficult sector to decarbonize here in the Northeast. So just giving a quick background on New Jersey and what you're currently seeing for residential heating fuel. So looking at kind of the 10-year transformation of the thermal sector, natural gas has experienced slight growth in most homes in New Jersey. Use natural gas to heat their homes. Heating oil has lost significant market share over the last 10 years. Electricity's experienced growth of almost 2.6% per year over the last 10 years, due mainly to electrification policy. Propane's just a very small piece of the market and slightly grown, and other heating fuels have grown a small amount as well. I think one of the things about the U.S. Census Bureau data, and certainly I've found this in New England states as well, is when a home converts to electricity or air source heat pumps, typically they use a backup heat source, and the Census Bureau will write that down and mark that as a electricity home, but it's really a dual fuel heated home. Looking at kind of the potential for change and decarbonization of the thermal sector, especially residential, I think you can kind of quantify the value of each heating technology by their ability to reduce their carbon score over time as New Jersey tries to meet their 2030 and 2050 goals. Looking at each technology, heating oil blended with biodiesel can reduce its carbon score by about 66 to 72% from soy-based biodiesel. Economically, biodiesel is a drop-in fuel, and there's few, if any, required equipment upgrades or changes needed up to 50% blend. And over that, there's slight equipment upgrades needed. Biodiesel blends of 30 to 50% can compete with cold climate heat pumps in the Northeast, and that's specifically with the ISO New England grid, PJM being a little bit higher in carbon intensity. A lower blend can compete with that. 5% to 25% biodiesel blends can achieve a better carbon score than natural gas, and 5 to 10% biodiesel blends can achieve a better carbon score than propane. Natural gas, as you heard a little bit about natural gas earlier, and RNG improvements and green hydrogen projects that have gone its place in New Jersey, has the ability to reduce their carbon score significantly. It will require some infrastructure improvements, and I believe it'll be pretty difficult to displace the high volume of natural gas in both the electric and thermal building supply in New Jersey. Green hydrogen and renewable hydrogen are going to be pursued and should, and the way they're able to lower the carbon intensity is definitely going to keep them around. Is very competitive, especially in electric generation. Electricity, as you know, air source heat pumps can reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and with the state's goal of meeting carbon neutral by 2050, air source heat pumps are obviously politically being pushed for that reason. Propane struggles to reduce their carbon score at scale in any meaningful way at this time. Looking kind of at the Energy Master Plan and goals, essentially similar to almost all policy in the Northeast right now, especially in the thermal sector and the building sector, is to electrify everything. here in Massachusetts and all around New England, air source heat pumps in every home is what the state government, Department of Energy in each state are trying to achieve. Kind of looking at some of the flaws to that policy and some of the reasons that there should be some pause when considering a policy that simply looks at electrification as the only solution. I've done a few different studies on what it would cost to electrify buildings at the residential level. I've done a study in New York and in Massachusetts based on a rebate program for air source heat pumps in the state, was able to get data either through publicly available data or through Freedom of Information Act requests. I received thousands and thousands of applications for rebates for air source heat pump systems with a bunch of information that I was able to kind of look at what this would truly cost. This study specifically was in New York, and from 2017 to 2019, NYSERDA offered a rebate program for air source heat pump systems. Different levels of incentives were based on the size of the system. How I kind of determined whether it was a whole home solution, I think one of the things I always have looked at is if we're going to electrify everything, the goal is to electrify the entire home. You don't want a backup heat source. You want to provide a heat throughout the winter, no matter the temperature. And then we can truly quantify what that conversion would be, whether it's from natural gas, propane, or heating oil. So the way I've kind of filtered that is looking at the incentive given by NYSERDA in this program, plus whether NYSERDA looked at it and quantified it as a whole home solution, or if the installer, which reported with the end user, reported it as providing 100% of the annual heat load. For the applications in the NYSERDA study, it was about 5,756 applications for single-family detached homes in the program. Just over 93% of those were not whole home solutions. They were either a single room ductless splits or other heat pumps that didn't provide the full home solution. About 6.7% were whole home solution. Looking at whole home solutions, there was about 386 whole home solution applications over the 3-year period. The average square footage of conditioned space was slightly below the average square footage of conditioned space of a home in New York. What the data revealed here is the average cost. Well, the average square footage of conditioned space was about 1,663 square feet. The median size of residence in New York is about 1,764 square feet, so slightly below the average. The average cost was just over $17,000 looking at the median size residence. For the smaller homes, it was about $16,272 for the conversion. Looking at the legacy heat source and where these, what was the heating system prior to the conversion, 29% were oil, 27% were natural gas, 23% were electric upgrades. And looking at the bottom chart here, about heating oil was the most expensive to convert from. Electricity and propane were really 2 and 3, and natural gas was the cheapest to convert over from. Looking at some of the other trends I was able to get from the data, I was able to get the zip code of all of these conversions in New York over the 3-year period. And when I ran those conversions on top of the heat map of median household income by county, a trend emerged that wasn't too surprising after seeing similar data in Massachusetts, but because of the high cost of conversions of these air source heat pump systems, you're typically only seeing the conversions in higher income communities. The problem with that is that there's already a gap in emissions between high income communities and environmental justice communities in the Northeast, and the amount of residences in climate poverty has been rising over the year, and so the energy affordability gap in turn has been rising over the years. So when you see these high efficiency cold climate air source heat pumps being installed only in higher end communities and reducing emissions in higher income communities, in seeing little to none in lower income communities, it's a huge problem when we talk about decarbonizing the industry. Looking at the second study I did, which was in Massachusetts, just giving a quick study, a quick summary, there was about 22,000 applications for air source heat pump rebates over a 5-year period in Massachusetts. About 622 of them were whole home conversions. Looking at the average cost, well, the average square footage condition space was significantly lower than the median sized residence in the state. In the average total cost of conversion was slightly over $20,000 for a conversion. And I think the next slide was really most telling as far as how effective these heat pump systems are. So of the 622 air source heat pump conversions that had been ruled a whole home solution, 92.8% of them reported that they had a supplementary heat source. The majority of the time, those were the legacy heat source that was left in place. So if you're converting from heating oil to an air source heat pump system, you're leaving your heating oil system in place and still running that for a small percentage of the year when it gets really cold and the cost of electricity goes through the roof. And also the heat pumps aren't able to provide enough heat to sufficiently heat the homes. Talking to a number of installers here in Massachusetts, they're telling homeowners if they're converting to air source heat pump systems, they have to keep their backup heat source because they won't be able to provide 100% of the annual heat load. Looking at the last study here, after I put out the Massachusetts CEC rebate program study, Mass CEC did a whole home heat pump pilot program from 2019 to 2021. It just ended a few months back. The pilot program required that the air source heat pump system was capable of heating the entire home and be used throughout the entire winter. For existing homes, the program only served installations displacing natural gas. And for new constructions, the homes couldn't use any fossil fuel appliances for hot water cooking. So at the end of the program, they reported the data and they did 126 retrofits. The average square footage of the home was significantly smaller than the median size residence in Massachusetts. So typically only smaller homes were doing it. And the median project cost was about $20,000 to convert these homes from natural gas to air source heat pump systems. They even updated about halfway through the program, and they used the average project cost, which at that point was about $22,000. With the final report, they moved back to the median. New construction and gut rehab projects, there was a few of those as well. Very small as far as square footage wise, and the costs were still significant. The program director at the Clean Energy Center in Massachusetts concluded that costs were much higher than they hoped, and she noted that 25% of these conversions required an electric service upgrade, and 38% reported that their natural gas heating system also provided domestic hot water, and their natural gas boiler still stayed in place. So was it a full whole home conversion? That's certainly debatable. So kind of looking at a summary of these 3 studies I did in Massachusetts and New York, the cost of converting any residence in an existing home to an air source heat pump system is extremely expensive. Any middle or low income residents in New Jersey wouldn't be able to afford the conversion. And a lot of what comes up is, well, at the end of life of the system, what we could do is just then put in the air source heat pump systems. And even looking at this, if you say, well, it's going to cost about $20,000 to do, replacing a natural gas system or a heating oil system typically costs between $7,000 and $10,000. So you're talking about a significant added expense in order to do that. kind of the key takeaways here from this, it's extremely expensive to convert your home to air source heat pump systems. Only high income households in the Northeast are currently doing it. There was extremely slow adoption of this, despite a ton of policy pushing for air source heat pump conversions in residences. Massachusetts and New York reported less than 200 conversions per year to whole home systems. And that's over a 3-year period and a 5-year period. And most residences retain their legacy heat source and use that supplementary legacy heat source on cold winter days. Another concern in kind of looking at field studies at this point is that despite these air source heat pump systems being installed and residences receiving rebates for it, most homeowners are choosing not to use them in the winter at all, and some at least not on the cold winter days. The reason for that is they install the system, they use it for great electricity, great air conditioning in the summer. And then in the winter, there's a higher cost of electricity. There's operability issues in cold weather. And the installers at scale are telling them, maybe you shouldn't be using this for all the time. You need to keep your backup heat source. Looking at consumer behavior, particularly, Massachusetts set a goal of 100,000 conversions to air source heat pumps per year from 2020 to 2030. An August 2021 article just came out in the Boston Globe, noting that only 461 homes were converted to electric heat in 2020, which of course missed the state goal by 99,539 conversions, quite significant. And NYSERDA is same issues. Looking at one field study to kind of try to understand the consumer behavior of electrification. ISO New England did a study on 18 homes in Massachusetts and did hourly readings of the electricity usage. So they measured the electricity output in 18 homes over the course of a winter from 2017 to 2018 with natural gas or heating oil in the home. Then they installed air source heat pump systems in the 18 homes during the summer and measured the hourly electrical output from 2018 to 2019 for the winter. They used that data to project what a million home conversions in New England through 2030 would do to the winter peak load and annual average grid load. They came out with some really low projections for what that would mean for the electric grid in the winter peak load. When I emailed them to talk about it, their answer was, well, despite us putting the air source heat pump systems in their home, all 18 homes used their air source heat pumps for less than 50% of their annual heat load. So despite the air source heat pump systems going in, they simply used their air source heat pump systems for electricity in less than 50% of their heat load, left their natural gas or heating oil system in, and used those during the winter. Looking at the cost of greenhouse gas reduction to the homeowner. So certainly the Biden administration came out with a preliminary estimate of the social cost of carbon at $51 per ton of CO2 reduction. Really, it's a good benchmark to look at policy and use that number and say, okay, any policy that would cost more than the $51 would be not the greatest cost-effective policy. Anything less than that would be extremely cost-effective and a good policy to put into place. Looking at the NYSERDA air source heat pump system, based on it was the lowest cost, and I thought the safest approach to go. Looking at the marginal emissions rate of the winter, in that being natural gas-fired electricity, the cost would be significant to the homeowner, nearly $2,000 per ton of CO2 reduced for the conversion, versus a bioheat costing about 10 cents more on average than heating oil, but only cost the homeowner $6.73 per ton of CO2 reduction. Looking at the PJM grid and the developments in clean electricity over time, Nuclear has increased substantially from 2000 to 2020. Natural gas has as well. Coal's been reduced down to 19%. Wind's increased to 3.3%. Hydro 2. Petroleum has been reduced to almost nothing. On average, electricity in the winter is more expensive than electricity in the summer and has a higher carbon intensity. Typically, you'll see, especially here in New England, also in the PJM grid, the marginal emissions rate in the winter is significantly higher, and the cost of electricity is higher as well. With looking at the Energy Master Plan goals and New Jersey's goals of reducing a carbon intensity from electricity and increasing renewable electricity growth, retrofitting buildings with air source heat pumps while electrifying vehicles as well will increase the grid load, increase the cost of electricity, increase the carbon intensity of electricity, increase the energy affordability gap, because lower income homeowners can't afford putting air source heat pumps in their homes. It will require grid infrastructure improvements, specifically looking at ISO New England versus PJM. Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection put out their integrated resources plan in 2020. And part of that was they're looking to get to carbon neutral electricity by 2040. One of their major concerns was that their transmission lines wouldn't be able to handle any more renewable electricity than they currently had without a complete overhaul of the infrastructure. That, of course, is going to add significantly to the cost of electricity, and that typically will fall on the ratepayers as well. Looking at getting to net zero carbon electricity in New Jersey, we currently have a set grid load and a set winter peak load, and you're looking to get to 100% renewable for that winter peak load. Installing air source heat pumps in homes could nearly double that and just push the goalposts further and double the amount of renewable electricity needed to support that in homes. When you have other options like biodiesel blended in heating oil that can reduce carbon intensity, you have renewable natural gas, you have green hydrogen. These technologies can reduce emissions at scale and can also alleviate that grid load and help the electric sector reach net zero in a much quicker nature, right? So looking at commercial buildings specifically, a good example, Boston just came out with a new policy for buildings that all commercial buildings have to be net zero by 2050. The way they're doing that is in 5-year intervals, they have to reduce their carbon intensity. So in 2025, the carbon intensity has to be reduced 20% versus a base year. There are other ways to meet compliance. You can pay an alternative compliance payment of $234 per metric ton. You can purchase renewable electricity certificates in the Renewable Portfolio Standard, Class 1, so wind and solar. So speaking to a number of building owners in Boston, modeling this out for them, one of the things they said is they're not retrofitting their buildings for their thermal usage. It's simply too high cost to go to air source heat pumps, and they don't believe air source heat pump systems could work in large commercial buildings. So they're focusing on the electric side of things, and they said, we're going to buy as much renewable electricity as possible. But as far as the thermal side of things, we're not going to electricity for our commercial buildings. And so certainly looking at the Energy Master Plan and other policy that's pushing for electrification of commercial buildings, there is going to be significant pushback. And when there are policies that provide options for meeting the goals that aren't necessarily decarbonizing their building, they're going to take those options. Looking kind of at how you should heat your home in the Northeast, and looking at the potential of renewable liquid heating fuels, biodiesel, it can displace heating oil today and at scale. I work in the Alternative Portfolio Standard, which incentivizes renewable thermal technologies in Massachusetts. And when one heating oil retailer joins the program and decides to blend biodiesel, they're immediately delivering that to 5,000, 10,000 homes, as many customers as they have. and it's reducing emissions at scale in 5 or 10,000 homes at no cost to the end user. And it's reducing them today immediately as a drop in fuel with the real slow adoption of air source heat pumps and the ability to quickly reduce emissions and displace heating oil gallons through biodiesel. It's so much more effective today in reducing emissions. Greenhouse gas emissions today are so much more valuable than reducing emissions tomorrow. I always think of it as almost like compound interest, right? If you're putting greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere today, those are hanging around for the next 20, 50 years in their life cycle analysis. It's reducing those emissions today is extremely valuable at scale. Biodiesel is readily available. It's mandated currently in Connecticut, New York, and Rhode Island. There are programs incentivizing it also in Massachusetts. And it could be a very good option for lower income communities that have lower income households and buildings that have heating oil that can immediately be displaced with biodiesel and reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 66 to 82%. Looking at electrification, it's a high cost of conversion for both residences and commercial buildings. It adds to the grid load, which will increase the price of electricity for all ratepayers. So as you're installing air source heat pumps in places where homeowners can afford them, so higher income communities, that's going to increase the grid load in the winter and increase the cost of electricity for all end users, including the end users who can't afford to put air source heat pumps in their house. It'll increase the grid load and increase the winter peak load, therefore it'll increase the carbon intensity of electricity, and it'll increase the amount of renewable electricity needed to meet carbon neutral grid. Supplementary heat source until technology evolves is certainly to a significant degree, and there'll be major infrastructure upgrades required as we convert vehicles and buildings to air source heat pumps. So kind of my conclusion in really looking in working in a lot of states here in the Northeast is decarbonizing the building sector needs to be an all-inclusive approach. I think the value of any technology is a technology that can economically reduce their carbon intensity at scale and should be given the opportunity to do so. Any legislation that chooses winners and losers will really stop the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in any state that occurs. I think any legislation that values all technologies that reduce emissions at scale and can do it at cost is the policy that will help us quickly and effectively and efficiently and economically meet our goals. With that, I can take any questions and thank you again for the time and opportunity to present.
Joe, thank you very much. Unfortunately, given the lateness of the day, we're not going to have time for questions, but I will remind everybody that this was recorded. It'll be available. Everyone's slides will be available as well. I want to thank you all who have hung in here at the end, including all those who have been on virtually and have watched. I want to also thank all our speakers again for their excellent presentations today. I want to thank Michelle Sakurka, Chrissy Peters, my bosses, for the leadership in order to put this on. And I especially want to thank our event staff and the IT folks who have made this seamless and made my job easy. So thank you all over there. Again, have a good weekend, everyone. The bar is upstairs.